Welcome back to What Arty Noobs with General Disturbance. This is the IS-3. It's a Tier 8 Soviet heavy tank. It's located on the eastbourne of Studzianki and it's under the command of Magyver1970. Now, this heavy tank is, well, regarded as the heavy tank you have to learn how to play if you want to learn to play tactically with other people in a platoon. Because, well, it's the kind of universal heavy tank, or supposedly. It's actually quite an unusual tank because it came about after a change in a departure in heavy tank design. Previously, the tanks had been on the KV line and then they moved over to the IS line, and they were following a pattern, you might say. But this one was a complete departure because it was a cast turret. Quite a big turret at that, mounted on top of a hull which was optimised to stop shells hitting the front of the vehicle or deflecting them away from the armour, and that's why it's got that famous pike nose, which was quite a novel feature. It's got a 122mm gun capable of 390 alpha, and with the standard ammunition it'll penetrate 225, but you can see here Magyver has only opted to have premium ammo, which is capable of 265mm of pen. Now he's up against the Lurva, which, as you know, has got fairly good frontal armour, so difficult to pen that one, but he managed to punch that one through. Can't see the exact spot that it went through, but I think it may have been the lower turret ring, and he's blocking 90mm rounds coming from IKV2, as well as the 105mm rounds coming from that Lurva. Yep, well and truly blocking them. Now the gun, the 122mm, is the same gun in the IS-2, and they started development work on this tank immediately. The first IS-2 came out of the production line, and that was in 8th of April 1944. So they were already thinking about a replacement for the IS-2 immediately. And the IS-2 made a big impression, but the IS-3 made an even bigger impression when it was first seen, mainly because people were shocked. They saw this tank and thought, oh my god, this is completely different. Well, he's killed the Lurva and he's moving on. Now, they only produced 2,311 of these, and that's with all the variants that they produced as well. They didn't produce quite so many because they had a lot of problems with it as well. It wasn't as straightforward as it actually seemed. The turret itself is actually bigger than the turret ring, so it kind of overhangs on the edge. You can see that if you look at the model, it is kind of overhanging the actual ring itself, and you can see that if you ever meet one up front and see it at any display. I had the chance to actually have a look over one of these at Tank Fest when it came over from Belgium. Now, they actually start mass producing these in May of 1945, and just before the war ended they had 10 ready and delivered in January 1945. So those were pre-prototypes, you might say, or post-prototypes, but before mass production. And they were intended to see action, and they were given to Guards regiments, but they never actually went into action. And there goes the Object 416. It's interesting to note that some people call the IS-3 the Object 244, and that's according to the encyclopedia, and other people call it the Object 703. Now, of course, you know the 703 version 2 is the double-barrel premium Soviet heavy tank. But it does look very much the same, but according to the encyclopedia it's the 244, which is the actual object number that the IS-3 was derived from. Now, it did take part in the victory parade in Berlin, and that's why he's got his third kill, second kill rather. That's why it shocked so many people, because the Allies didn't know about this tank at all, and when they first saw it they thought, oh my god, this is huge, and also they didn't know if they could defeat it. So it became the kind of standard for any heavy tank that they had to try and destroy. It was up against the standard, the IS-7. You see that AT-7 didn't know who to aim at. He almost tried to aim at MacGyver, but then in the end he suddenly realised that there was a bigger threat coming from elsewhere, and he turned to face the tank to MacGyver's right, the Jagdpanzer here, and that's when MacGyver finished him off. Now the turret is cast. It's a big cast steel block. The armour at the front is fairly thick as well on the hull, 110mm at the front, 90 at the sides, 60 at the rear. The turret though, because of its cast ability, is 249mm at the front and 172 at the sides and 100 at the rear, and it's very, very solid when you look at it. But the Soviets actually left a major weak spot on the turret. That's just above the gun magnets. There's a flat area and it's very thin roof armor. You can just about make it out there. In fact, you can see that one of the enemy tanks was actually aiming specifically for the weak spot and failed to get it through. It's a 13mm steel plate on the top of the magnets, and you can overmatch that armor if you've got something of over 90mm or above, and penetrate through that armor and damage the tank. Now, I'm not quite sure why they did that, but I suppose they thought that nobody would actually be able to aim for a position so precise directly above the gun, and that's why they didn't do it. Oh, it was behind him. The IKV got behind him, and he's in the copse at the top of the map. Okay, so he's now going to have to go and deal with that IKV because he can't leave him there. Now, you could only carry 28 rounds in the IS-3. There wasn't really a huge amount of space, but it was also the fact that they were 122mm shells, and they're quite big shells. So there was only 28 rounds, and it was normally 18 HE rounds and 10 armor piercing. So if these tanks ever were used to invade Europe, they wouldn't have a whole lot of shells to puncture enemy tanks or European tanks before, of course, they'd have to be resupplied. Of course, the big threat was that the Soviets would then decide to go straight through after invading Eastern Europe and then try and conquer Western Europe as well. Because although Joe Stalin was an ally, he was an ally in charge of a Soviet army who behaved very much like the army that we're seeing today in Ukraine. Really, they adhere to the Viking book of rape, pillage and loot whatever's available, and that's how they just mow down the enemy with sheer numbers and rather inept leadership, you could say. And MacGyver's opting to go straight for the cap. He's well, it's not his cap, it's his cap actually, it's not the enemy cap, but he's trying to goad that IKV into shooting at him. There's only 4 enemies left, and they're facing 6 tanks on MacGyver's side, and well, he's not firing, he's running, obviously. Okay, there's the enemy. Time to apply that big 390 armor. Oh, 408! But he didn't get the kill. That actually went to the AMX M445. We managed to get in one before we did. And now it's a case of finding the IS-2 shielded, the E25 and the box tank, which are the only ones left on the enemy team. Now, it doesn't have a very good view range, this tank, and you can probably understand why, with of course all that heavy armour and that skillet shaped turret. It's the view range is only 350 meters, so fairly short. The engine's not as powerful as most people think. It's well, it's fairly low power actually overall. It's 740 horsepower. That's what they've actually reduced it to, but I think it was a lot less than that when they were actually designing this tank. So I tried a blind shot there. Don't think that came off though. So it's not quite as manoeuvrable as all that. It does have a fairly low profile, and of course that is something that a lot of Soviet tanks have tried to have, a low profile, so that they're less likely to be spotted, and if they are spotted, then it's difficult to get shots on their weak spots. The one thing about this tank though is that when it does get into a face hug with some tanks, it can actually oh, and the IS-2 shielded is a AFK. When it goes into a face hug with some German and some Japanese tanks, it's below their gun pressure, so that does actually help, because it means that the enemy really can't get shots on you, except maybe through that weak spot. Box tank, one shot. He had taken some damage before our shell went in. 20% of the enemy hit pool, so he's on for a high caliber if he can get it. There's only one enemy left, it's the E-25. And remember, he's got that 75mm. He got him with a blind shot. He guessed where he was, and he was there. And that is the end of the game. Here's the end of battle stats. That was an ace tanker game for MacGyver1970 in the IS-3. He managed to get a spotter badge for spotting at least 1,000 hit points of damage, a bruiser medal for getting at least 5 critical hits, in fact he got 7, a fire for effect for doing more damage than the hit points for his own vehicle, and a shell proof for blocking more damage than the hit points for his own vehicle. On top of that, he got a couple of battle hero medals, or 3 of them actually. He got a steel wall for blocking the most damage in the game, at least 11 hits and over 1,000 hit points of damage, as well as a high caliber for dealing the most damage in the game, and a top gun for getting at least 6 kills. In fact, the E-25 was the 6th kill of the game. We look at team score, we can see, yep, he's got the top with 4,591 hit points. The closest to him was the Scorpion on the enemy team with 4,319. He wasn't far behind. And when it came to kills, yeah, he's got that one too as well. 6 kills for him. The next highest was 2 kills by the AMX M445, the T44 on his own team, the Scorpion on the enemy team, and their E25. And when it came to base XP, yeah, he's got that one as well. So he's got the top in all 3 columns. 1,614 went to MacGyver, 816 went to the AMX M445, and then we're looking at the E25 on his own team with 796. He fired 21 rounds in the game, so he only had 7 rounds left. 16 direct hits on the enemy, 14 penetrations, damage of 4,591, of which 405 were at more than 300 meters. 21 hits received from the enemy, a lot of hits received from the enemy, most of them while he was fighting it out at the factory. 5 penetrations, 16 non-penetrations, and he blocked damage of 3,910 hit points in total. He spotted 5 enemy vehicles, damaged 9 of the enemy, killed 6, did 1,430 hit points of damage assistance. I think really that's spotting assist. He earned 50,279 credits from the game, 37,710 from personal reserves, 55,000 for mission completion, a total of 168,129 altogether. But, and it's a big but, he did fire nothing but premium ammo, and as a result his cost was so great that he actually only ended up with 59,569 credits profit, and that's after he got that mission completion amount. Otherwise he would have ended up with just 4,000 odd. 1,614 XP times 2 for the first victory, 4,842 for mission completion, I think that was holiday ops actually, and 9,684 experience points altogether. So yes, the IS-3, it's very much a standard tank. Let's have a look at the armor profile and see what it looks like. Well, from the front you can see, just about make out that angled, the pike nose, the angled armor on the front, but it's the turret that draws your attention. Look how strong it is from the front. If somebody's firing at the turret on this one, they're not going to go very far. In fact, it's so well crafted, this casting, the beautiful casting actually. Although when you actually see it in person, you say, well, that looks a bit rough. But remember, it's actually made in sand, and they're casting the shape and then pouring the metal into the hot metal into the sand to try and get that specific shape. So yes, it's actually a very, very good design in terms of its trying to force those enemy shells to literally careen off, to ricochet off at the front of the hull. Excuse me. You can see that most of these very red areas, the chances are the shell would actually bounce off because it just wouldn't be able to dig in at all. But on some of the areas, yes, it would dig in. They've got a ricochet up there, bounce, bounce. Yeah, it's very, very strong at the front on the armour. Don't want to aim for the turret really, except aiming for one or two specific areas. The cupola, which of course you would always aim for on any tank really, because it's a weak spot. 80mm of armour, its effective is about the same, but this is the weak area here. This armour, the impacted armour, it's showing as only 20mm. And so if you can hit this little area here, this little square area on top, this little shield over the gun mantlet, if you can put a shell in there, it'll probably go straight through. It'll overmatch the armour. It won't bounce off, even though it's almost completely flat and you'd think that a shell would bounce in and careen off. No, it will actually overmatch the armour and go straight through. If you want to try and penetrate down below on the hull, your best bet is this lower plate, because it's 110mm on the lower plate, but it comes out at 211 because of the angling. But it's a lot less than trying to punch into this area here where it's 130mm armour, but with the angling and everything, it actually turns out quite a bit more. It's 204, you can see there, about 180 there. But the shells, if they're coming straight in, are very likely to bounce straight off. And ideally, you don't want to angle this tank against the enemy, because if you do, you're presenting a flatter surface, which means that there's no angling to actually stop the shells, and of course the angling is working against you. So now you can see impacted armour is still the 13cm, but the effective armour's dropped to 182. So if you angle an IS-3, you're actually giving the enemy an advantage. You ideally want to remain straight onto him, but not let him get that lower plate. So ideally hide the lower plate behind some rock or some rubble or whatever, and just let him see the top of that turret, the top of that front plate, because if he then tries to fire and punch in, he's actually got to get something like 200mm of pen in order to go through that plate. But if you angle your tank, you will actually be lowering that that value and making it easier for him. There is the driver's port again. Trying to get the shot into there is very difficult, but it is a shot track just in there. You might be able to get through the driver's port if you're lucky, but I wouldn't count on it. The sides still fairly strong, 90mm. And again, you've got another kind of false angling, spaced armour here, where you can see it looks like it extends out, but in actual fact the hull is here. This is the edge of the hull, and this is just sheet metal which is acting as shaped spaced armour. So if a shell comes in here, it's more likely going to bounce down and not penetrate the hull. And of course the spaced armour takes something away from the actual shot as it comes in. You can see impacted armour is actually 30mm, that's the space bit, and then after that it's got the impacted armour afterwards of 90mm, that's the actual side of the hull. So effective armour is really high if you try and shoot above the tracks. If you shoot below them, it's a little lower. You can see 90mm, effective armour 125. So it's actually easier to aim below the tracks or in between the bogies. Don't aim for the shoulder area at all if you can, because you're more than likely going to miss or it's not going to pen. Of course, the rear you can pen. It's only 60mm, effective 66. And the rear of the turret, well, 70mm with effective 94 because of the angling. So you can see it's a very tough tank to penetrate, and it requires you to actually try and keep straight onto the enemy rather than to angle, because the more you angle, the more they can punch through this upper plate. Of course, if they try to go for the other side, they'll bounce off. But if they go for this side, it's much easier for them. So try and keep your front to the enemy like this, and it makes it stronger against an enemy tank. So that's the armor. Let's have a look at the modules. Okay, driver up front, which is kind of like the model you see on the IS-2 onwards, because the IS-2's got the driver in the center up front. On the, you can see the turret actually got the gunner right next door to the gun, with the TC directly behind him and the radio alongside him. The loader is actually sitting on the other side of the tank, and you can see the ready rack is wrapping around the side of the tank. So on the left hand side here, it wraps around the back and almost to the commander on the other side of the tank. And unfortunately, this is a design flaw, although it's in the safe area of the tank in terms of the IS-3, but it's a design flaw that they've actually carried through to the T-72, because by putting the ammo rack all around the actual tank, you've made it certain that if somebody does punch and penetrate through that armor, then they're going to hit the ammo rack and they're going to set the thing off. And that's what actually happens in the T-72. Although I should what's the word, qualify that, yes, by actually saying that in the T-72 the ammo rack is in the base or underneath the turret, and it's in the base of the top of the hull, which means that if you can punch a shell through the side of the hull, it goes straight through into the ammo rack, and then obviously it sets that thing off because it's in a kind of, the turret is sitting in a bowl of an ammo rack. And that's why you're seeing so many T-72s in Ukraine have had their turrets blown off, because of course they've been ammo racked by the shell going in just the right spot and it's blowing them to pieces. Normally the ammo rack can be caused by a tank round, but it can also be caused by the missiles that are being fired at the tank. And of course the Ukrainians are having a lot of success with their Studzianki model, which is actually penetrating the ammo rack through the sides of the tank and setting it off, whereas the Javelin is going in through the roof and the N-Law is going over the engine deck and punching down through the engine deck. So there you go, 3 different directions that the shells are actually hitting these T-72s, but they're all having the same effect of actually blowing the tank to pieces because it's a very bad design. The IS-3 was basically one of the tanks on the road to getting that T-72. There's another ammo rack in the actual hull, you can see there on both sides, and one directly underneath the loader. At the back of the tank, we've got the engine squeezed between 2 fuel tanks there with the transmission at the back. So ideally, if you can get behind an IS-3, you shoot it in the back of the turret because you're more likely going to hit the ammo rack that way. If you can get the sides, well, as I say, don't aim for the shoulders. Aim for between the tracks if you can, to try and punch through. If you can get behind it, though, aim for either the fuel tanks or the ammo rack. And that should be able to get something. But if you're facing one of these from the front and he angles like that, immobilize him and then start punching rounds through that pike nose, because you might take out the driver as well, and that's going to hurt him as well in case of immobilization. So that's the IS-3. I hope you enjoyed that replay. If you did, please give this video a like. Do subscribe to our channel. Leave a little comment down below because it feeds the algorithm. And of course, please let other people know that not only does our channel exist, but we're giving all of the proceeds of our channel to the Red Cross Ukraine appeal to help the refugees. So the more of our videos you watch, the more money we can send to them. Even if you just have to put the video on rotation so that it just plays and plays endlessly in the background, please do so. Even if you turn the sound off and do that, so you're not actually having to listen to my terrible commentary. But if you do, then obviously that will help us, because that means that we can send more money to the refugees. Thanks for watching.